gang. I have another Canadian luthier built guitar on the bench today for a bit of a tune-up. This is a 00012 model from John LaCroix of the bustling metropolis of St. Thomas, Ontario. I suppose Americans would probably try and pronounce it LaCroix, but you don't get away with that here. I don't know a whole lot about these beyond what's available on Facebook and his website. John has been building since 2005, and I can tell right off the bat that there's a lot of care taken in construction. This seems to be a really nice piece of Engelmann spruce for the top. I appreciate the fact that he's left the pitch pocket in there. The back and sides are of walnut, which is kind of an overlooked guitar wood, really. It's beautiful stuff. I don't use it in my own work because it's one of the few woods that I'm actually allergic to. I break out in hives if I work it. It's got beautiful wood bindings. The neck is a pretty amazing three-piece lamination of curly maple. More walnut for the backstrap overlay. The head plate, fingerboard, and the bridge seem to be Ziricote. It's got some beautiful ray fleck figuring in it, which might be difficult for you to see. There's some pretty fantastic inlay. That's gorgeous. The rosette seems to be a chunk of box elder burl with some spalting in it. Originally there would have been some serious pink hues in this wood. It tends to dissipate with the exposure to UV, but still pretty gorgeous. It was brought to me because there's a fret that's not doing what it's supposed to do. This was looked at by somebody else and apparently dressed down a little bit, but clearly that didn't solve it. If we get in close here, we can see that the end of the fret is bouncy. What happens when you try and file or sand this to the height of its shiny brethren? The pressure from the file will push it back down as it's gliding over it, and then when it's done, it pops right back up again. So you're chasing an invisible phantom. We'll check out the setup as well while we're here. The action is okay, it's playable. It's around 6 1/2 64ths on the bass side, a little high on the treble. It's around 5 1/2 64ths. That would be like 85 thousandths, 100 thousandths, 2.5 millimeters on the bass, 2.2-ish on the treble. Apparently the nut slots were also filled a bit with some glue and bone dust to deal with buzzing on the open strings. This isn't a new guitar. It's been around for a while and it's been played. So some of these are just about perfect and some of them might actually be a little bit tall right now. So I might be able to dial that in closer. This guitar has some checking in the finish. This is nitrocellulose lacquer, and I've mentioned it before. There are a few different kinds of checking that can occur in lacquer. There's the type that happens from age as the finished film dries out. I'm tempted to equate it with what's known as craquelure in the art restoration world. I'm giving you guys all the French words today. That's a tight, square kind of check that looks like a Kalahari mud hole in dry season. You know, mud cracks, basically. Then there's this, and this is cold checking. In northern areas, when we take our guitars outside a warm rehearsal space or a club or something and pop them into the trunk of a car at minus 20 degrees, the lacquer, it shrinks so fast that any points of tension, often they'll happen at like right angles in the design, they become the focal point of stresses. And you end up with these big, long, unidirectional cracks that sort of just pop right up. Think about a stone chip in a car's windshield. It's very similar. They tend to not be as pretty because they're not part of an overall pattern of cracks. They sort of stick out like a sore thumb. But fixing them usually isn't feasible because they go all the way down to the wood surface and it could be a real mess trying to make them go away. You'd have to either dissolve or fill the lacquer and then sand everything flat again and rebuff it. It's usually best to just sort of let sleeping dogs lie and realize that in 30 years this thing is going to start cracking all over like an old Gibson anyway. There's some considerable rocking going on there. I've got the body propped up at an angle with a piece of foam under one side, so the thin super glue I'm going to be using is more apt to run this way, back along the fret, than down onto the body, which is upsetting. You know, I was editing last week's video with the Washburn that had a high fret in basically exactly the same position, and I thought to myself as I was doing that, hey, wait a minute, did you not make a tool for that? And yeah, I grabbed a random flat piece of metal. This is the kind of thing that happens in repair. You get rolling and maybe you've made so many tools, jigs, and fixtures that you forget sometimes. But yeah, this is basically the same thing in a more ergonomic package. Just a piece of flat aluminum with a handle on it for more easy handling. And the aluminum is rigid enough to do the job, it stays straight, and it's not hard enough to damage the frets, which is a good thing. I suppose you could also use brass. It's long enough to span at least 3 frets in any scale length, and keeps your fingers away from the glue. And in idle moments you can turn it around and practice sparring with an invisible dagger. I'll use a chisel to cut and scrape the little bit of squeeze out there. Sometimes, especially on maple boards, I'll wax everything off. It's not always necessary, especially on this dark stuff. There's always going to be a little bit of dressing work too that needs to be done to bring things into perfect line. Just kissing the tops of the frets. Then I'll recrown them. You can see I'm protecting the soundboard there with a piece of plastic sheeting, so I don't inadvertently run the file into it. Polishing, polishing, polishing. There's a limit to how low you can take a saddle. There's enough here to take off a scant 32nd of an inch or so. This saddle had a piece of wood shim glued to the bottom of it, which makes sanding easy. Turning to the nut end, the base E is more than 25 thousandths above the first fret, which is a little high. I'll bring it down to 21. Something that's interesting to me is the groove for the high E string here has been filled, and it's been moved over towards the center of the board about 1 millimeter, changing the spacing fairly dramatically. There are people out there who do need a bit of extra space between the edge of the board and the first string because they tend to, for whatever reason, pull it off the edge of the fret. Just technique. You know, I'm not going to change it back. I think it feels okay. It's just interesting to me, that's all. Here's a sweet little electric. This is a Collings guitar from those good folks in Austin, Texas. I believe this one is an LT 360 maybe? LT meaning level top. This is an example of their much appreciated dog hair finish. It's black and has a white pore filler in the grain of the mahogany, which is a pretty cool effect. Not that easy to do effectively, I learned. I tried it a few years ago for Alfie Smith's guitar, and I used a water-based top coat material and found that the white I used to fill the pores wanted to migrate up into the clear layers, and it ended up more gray and ghostly looking. It's still dog hair, but it's from a grayer dog. But this is quite beautiful. Bill Collings and his company got into building electrics in 2006, after, at that point, decades of making really highly esteemed acoustic guitars, really fine mandolins, things like the Waterloo brand, their offshoot that does the close copies of 1930s catalog guitars. So this is a pretty high quality unit, and we're going to do some electric work in it. We're going to swap out this bridge pickup for a DiMarzio Super Distortion, and we're going to move that guy over here, and we'll save the neck pickup for some other use. While we're under the hood, we'll also put in a pure tone jack, because the one that's in it is getting a little bit sloppy. Got some knobs, some white knobs. And the control configuration in this thing right now is a little bit strange, because the volumes are backwards. This volume knob here controls the bridge, in this case, and this one, the neck. Which I guess, depending on your perspective, if you only ever mess with the bridge volume when you're doing solos or something, then maybe it's easier to get to that one in front, but, you know, you'd want your entire collection wired that way to save embarrassment. There's one little quirk on these guitars, and that is they have just a single dot for the 12th fret marker. This player wants it to be more apparent, so we're going to put in more dots there. I had a quick look at the Collings website just to get up to date on their models and stuff if I could, but it doesn't seem like they're making this guitar anymore. The dog hair finish, maybe too many other people started copying them or something, I don't know. They didn't have this one. It's neat work and a good collection of parts. Got a Jupiter vintage tone 20 microfarad cap there in kind of vintage Gibson style. Here's a brief shout out. I got a new book. This is Complete Guitar Wiring from Jerry Hayes. This isn't a paid endorsement. We follow each other on Instagram, and when I saw this pop up I was pretty stoked, because there really aren't very many straightforward books on this subject, you know, despite its popularity. I had a copy of Donald Brosnack's old Guitar Electronics when I was in my 20s, but that got swiped from my bench at the music shop I was working at pretty soon after I bought the book, which was a frustrating experience. That book was okay, but it's been out of print for quite a while now, and to be honest, this is the book I wish I had when I was learning, because it's written in a way that progresses logically, and it can be understood by someone who maybe didn't have the luxury of an electronics course in high school. You don't have to read the schematics, in other words. I learned how to read schematics along the way, but it's still nice to see actual pictorial diagrams that look like the parts in front of you, especially when you're just getting started. It's a big help. So I give this one a thumbs up. Good book. Worth buying. With both volumes up to 10, they're slightly unbalanced in terms of output. And to my ear, I don't hear any change on the neck pickup with the tone control, where it's definitely at play on the volume, which is interesting. That's actually what the player wants in this case. The other thing is, bridge pickup is pretty floppy in there. There's not much pressure, probably as a piece of foam, so we want to stiffen that up for him as well. You know, I try to avoid pulling everything out of the guitar if I don't have to save both time and frustration. But I think this is one of those cases where I probably will, because this is deep and tight, and I want to do clean work. Pulling out these pickups, I see the neck is dated June 12th, 2018. So this guitar is not very old. It's 4 years old, but it's got significant play wear on it, and lots of bumps and dents and buckle rash. So it was well loved for a short time. The bridge pickup is a Seymour Duncan custom shop humbucker in a P90 case. Moving the bridge pickup over to the neck space means the lead isn't long enough now, so I have to splice on some extra length. I put the pickup in place and use the screws here just to mark the positions. P90 screws aren't strong enough to be driven into mahogany without pilot holes. I also trim them to length so there's no way they can come out the other side. And rather than foam, I'm using rubber tubing. It'll be more secure and less noisy than springs. There's a tendency for some companies to try and make this access hole between these two cavities as small as it can possibly be for the wire that they use, and then you end up with a situation like this where we're using thicker than average shielded wire, and there's no way to get both of these cables down through that hole. So I have to re-drill it. It's not an easy hole. I'm using an extended bit and trying to keep on line with what was there previously and not run the drill into the guitar body. You know how long it took me to get those wires through? Better part of half an hour. Here's another slightly annoying thing that certain manufacturers do. They'll come along and snip off the unused lugs on a pot, ostensibly to keep them from grounding out against wires or something. But it also severely limits the number of modifications you can do. So I'm probably going to have to get another pot for this. I think I mentioned that this player likes to have the tone control only operational on the bridge side of things. So in order to do that, I have to isolate the tone pot, basically putting it in line with the bridge before it reaches the switch, so that when the contact is made on the neck side of things, this isn't going to be operational at all. So what I do is I go directly from the pickup to the tone control and then over to the bridge before heading to the switch, which is a little backwards in some ways. The other thing I have to do in this case is, because there is a capacitor that's joining both the volume and the tone pot, I'm going to have to do a different style of mounting where the capacitor doesn't bridge the two of them. It only goes to the back of the pot, such as you'd find on a lot of Fender designs. It's, you know, slightly different. The tonal change will be minimal, if anything, but it's necessary in this case to make this scheme work. When working with capacitors, it's good practice to use an alligator clip to act as a heat sink and protect the delicate inner workings. We don't need huge globs of solder or solder. A little dab will do. I try to get things coiled around as neat and securely as possible. The satisfying clunk tells me I got the wires in the right places. Turning to the 12th fret marker, I'm going to use smaller diameter dot material because with 3 of them it might look more visually balanced and slightly more elegant. This is one of those fragile finishes I was talking about in a recent video. It's just holding on there and it's really eager to delaminate. I did have to rely on the super glue again to kind of stick the bubbles back down. But I drilled the holes in the usual fashion. Put in the dots, wicked in the glue, cut them flush, paired them with a chisel, then sanded and polished. The new dots were just a little more white than the previous ones, so I tinted them to bring up a little bit more of a yellow tone. And there we go. This is how the bridge arrived. That is a very strange intonation line. Backwards in some areas. So I expect I'll have to change that. Okay, slightly more traditional saddle placement. It's actually set for open D, which this player uses a lot. It's an interesting guitar. It's nice. It's kind of a blend of features. It really is halfway between a Les Paul and a Telecaster in some ways. It feels kind of like a Music Man I worked on a few years ago. Yeah, nice.